Moving on, and the world's oceans simmered to their hottest temperatures on record last weekend. They are likely to warm even further in the coming months. That's according to the European Climate Service, Copernicus. This will put more stress on life both in the seas but also on land. After a summer of record-breaking heat waves and wildfires spurred by human-caused climate change, the temperatures are getting intolerable, even deadly. So what can be done and how fast can changes be put in place? To give us their insight, we're joined by Professor of Sustainably Built Environments and Health at the University of Cambridge, Ronita Bardhan. Thanks so much for your time. Good to have you with us here on France 24. First of all, can I ask you, in the immediate term, starting with the individual, what can they do to adapt to these ever-rising temperatures?
I think at this point, our main priority question is to provide health and well-being and safety, thermal safety to our population. And the primary thing that can be done is to protect them in wherever they are. If they're outside, providing enough amount of cooling access in terms of either shading or hydration towers or areas that can be mechanically cooled and people can take refuge there. If they are indoors, there should be certain amount of guidance around how to reduce the amount of solar radiation that is entering indoors so that the heat is not trapped throughout the day and then probably gets hotter much during the nighttime. So first line of action would be to cool down the homes, cool down the person or the people themselves, whether using mechanical cooling or whether using other sorts of passive cooling technologies. That's a decision to be made on context, but we need to prioritize people's health and well-being at this point.
Indeed, and we don't yet have the full figures of excess deaths due to the heat waves this summer. When you speak about mechanical cooling, I mean, it's becoming a bigger and bigger debate here in Europe, this question of air conditioning, and many people wondering, what the actual cost it has when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, so I think at this point, because people are braving the heat and this is seems more like an emergency situation, I think the choice should not be whether we should adapt air conditioning en masse or we should debunk completely the climate action that has been going on. It is about currently providing the thermal safety that is required and is the demand of the time, but also start thinking about planning how to not just cool individuals using mechanical cooling, because that will open up multiple other ripple effects of problems, because generally these sort of extreme heat events also co-occur with heavy demand for energy. And that means if we prioritize air conditioning, we are trying to overemphasize or probably pressurize our own energy systems that are already pressurized during this time of the day, this time of the season, or when it is extremely hot outside and people are demanding more cooling, not just personal cooling, but also warehouses to keep our food and other perishable items fresh enough to be consumed by the population and there is a lot amount of energy demand. So if we start thinking and prioritizing just air conditioning, it might open up a much more wider gap in terms of understanding energy security that we are now. So the cost would be much more higher. It's not just carbon emissions that will come with it, but also urban heat island effects that will intensify. And so it's no longer just related to climate related extreme heat, but it will be more manufactured heat being trapped within the cities. And that needed to be combated.
So what's the alternative? I mean, what concrete action should be taken in the immediate term?
So I believe first, we should prioritize individual cooling at this point, using mechanical cooling if required, but also a wide array of other sorts of cooling mechanisms should be provided in access to the citizens, depending on, as I said, depending on where they are. If they are outdoors, we should quickly retrofit our cities with hydration towers, with cooling shaded areas or cooling centers so we can identify certain places that can be occupied by a large number of people who are seeking refuge from the extreme heat when they are outside, and also shifting the amount of work that is done during these extreme heat hours. So probably between the 11 to 2 to 3 p.m. when the heat is massive. So shifting some of these economic activities to a much more cooler time of the day. These sort of small interventions and emergency interventions are required at this point before we start thinking about long-term solutions. And that doesn't mean we completely leave long-term solutions. We have to think about adaptation also while we think about mitigation. And so we need to start planning about whom to keep cool, whom to prioritize in this whole cooling in the strategy. It is primarily the vulnerable population, the aging population, pregnant mothers, women and children that are more vulnerable to this extreme heat. They needs to be protected. So identifying that vulnerable group that are vulnerable due to this extreme heat and may cause severe health conditions to them, they need to be prioritized, and maybe personal mechanical cooling can be provided to them. And then those who are healthy, who are young, should be also allowed to take refuge in certain areas where cooling is provided at scale. So I believe there are multiple strategies that need to be brought in.
And finally, Professor Bardhan, I know you've worked across the globe. You've worked in India, Indonesia, worldwide. I mean, the situation we've seen in Europe frightened many of us here, but there's much more extreme conditions elsewhere. I'm reading in Pakistan, for example, where people can't even afford to have an air fan, and they're trying to survive by buying blocks of ice on certain days. Can you give us an idea of the situation globally and, where people are today?
So we also need to understand exposure doesn't really mean vulnerability to heat. There is not just the climate and action, it's also biology and physiological capacity to cope and recover within this heat is also a very important factor. So when we look at areas that has been traditionally very hot and now becoming extremely hot during the summers, probably first line of defense, or the first layer of defense, needs to be air conditioning, and that there is no denial about it. But also if you look at these cultures, they have embedded cooling mechanisms of cooling the body, personal cooling the body within their cultural practices. So if you look at clothing of the population who live in primarily in the very extreme heat regions, they wear much more breathable fabric that allow the ventilated body to cool down, that it doesn't trap the heat. So moving away from wearing much more lesser breathable fabric is one of the solution that we can adapt for and learn from these areas where people have seen extreme heat historically. But we also need to understand that in these areas there are vulnerable population who do not have access to anything in terms of not just cooling, but also in terms of water that helps them to locally adapt their thermal comfort levels, and their thermal distress is controlled, or they have the capacity to cope with it.
Professor Ronita Bardhan of Cambridge University bringing us some insight there on the climate situation.